Welcome to today's event, A View from the Border, Exploring Challenges and Solutions for Immigration Policy with advocates on the ground. My name is Hiroshi Motomura, faculty co-director of the Center for Immigration Law and Policy, or CILP, here at UCLA School of Law. I want to start with a land acknowledgement. We're at CILP. We're part of a land grant institution, and we want to acknowledge the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tombagar, the Los Angeles Basin, and the South Channel Islands. That's for us not just a ritual, the land acknowledgement, but it's something we take very seriously as a center with a mission to understand migration and its effects, and maybe more fundamentally to understand history, not just for its own sake, but how history matters today. So that land acknowledgement is very important. As a prelude to today's program, I want to offer some remarks to, I hope, frame the discussion. My core thought is that much of what's happening on the border reflects deeper problems with responses by governments to human migration. I'm speaking in the context of the US-Mexico border, but what I offer applies to many borders in many parts of the world. So first thought is that the main legal framework for responding to migrants who seek protection is out of date. It's what's called the Refugee Protection System. It reflects international law commitments in the 1951 Geneva Convention on Refugees. And the basic idea there is that people must not be returned to any place where they have a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. The key thing is that this definition of refugee is part of US law, as it is true in many other countries, but it's a narrow exception to national sovereignty, and it leaves out millions of people who don't qualify as refugees, but instead are beyond protection because they are relegated to being merely, quote, migrants, end quote. That's the first thought. The second framing thought is that the system doesn't just narrowly define who's protected. Worse yet, the system offers, if it offers protection at all, it does so only after migrants reach the border of the country that they're seeking protection, whether it's the United States or elsewhere. And this forces migrants to make dangerous journeys, asylum seekers to make dangerous journeys, sometimes from nearby, but sometimes from distant countries on the other side of the world. That happens before they get to the border. And for over a generation, countries of possible refuge have tried to keep migrants from reaching those borders so that these countries keep migrants from applying for asylum, the very protection that the law offers them in theory. So there's a big gap between theory and practice. That's the second thought. Third, even if migrants reach the border where they should be able to apply for protection, countries of possible refuge have imposed more obstacles. Rules disqualify people when they've traveled through what is a country that is deemed safe, even though they aren't safe at all in many cases. Other rules limit the number of people who can apply for asylum, and other rules have closed the border altogether. And the fourth thought is a very fundamental problem with how the United States and other countries think about migration, thinking about it as something that they can control and address on their own through walls, border guards, and cruel policies of punishment and deterrence. And these unilateral responses try to cast migration as a crisis and then use it for political opportunity, rather than to call it what it is, which is that people on the move in ways that have always been central in human history. And so sustainable and ethical responses to migration require a serious commitment to welcoming those who arrive, while also giving people a meaningful choice to stay at home, which means addressing what forces people to move, to where they move to escape famine or violence or the effects of climate change, to name just a few reasons. So what's important is looking at root causes. That seems to be especially missing because many of these causes reflect the actions of the United States and other countries of potential refuge. So it's essential, this is my main point, is for countries, as we think about the border and addressing migration, it's essential to have the respectful engagement with other countries that's been missing for so long, and certainly too long in immigration policy. So I'll close this framing with just a couple of thoughts about the border. One is that I've suggested the problems are in many ways not problems of the physical border, but instead problems of the way we think about migration. So I just want to, and that suggests that solutions are to be found away from the border. And that's true to some extent because, for example, the Biden administration's initiative to let people in from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela to come to the United States from their home countries without the dangerous trip to the border, that's been something that CILP has been involved in, as will come out in today's discussion. But it's an example of how the solutions to what happens on the border lie in humane responses elsewhere. The other thing is that what happens at the border has many effects away from the border. Many of the migrants who cross the border soon reach cities inside the United States, sometimes on their own, sometimes through the cynical practices of other states to bust them northward. But this just shows that what's happening inside the United States is very much a part of what's happening on the border. But I also want to say that, and this is my last thought, is that putting the border in context, as I tried to do, I want to acknowledge that it runs a serious risk, and it's the risk of pulling back so much from what's happening on the ground that we overlook a central truth, and that is that what happens on the border reflects and offers an essential perspective on injustices at the core of immigration law and policy. So on the one hand, I'm trying to put the border discussion that we're having today into context, but I also want to appreciate and celebrate our panelists' ability to speak from firsthand experience on the border itself and from their deep experience with the people and the communities who are most directly impacted by the U.S. border policy and practices. I can think of no one better to moderate this discussion than my colleague, Monika Langarica. Monika is a senior staff attorney here at CILP. She was previously at the ACLU of San Diego and Imperial Counties, where she led litigation and advocacy strategies during the Trump years. And before that, Monika was with the ABA Immigrant Justice Project, where she represented detained immigrants in removal proceedings. So Monika, I'll take it. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Hiroshi, for that, for the introduction and for the level set. I think it's so important to contextualize and ground the conversation that we're going to have today in this larger context. So welcome everybody who has joined us today. We are so thrilled to start this discussion. And just very quickly, a housekeeping note before I introduce our really wonderful panelists. For our audience who has joined, if you have any questions throughout this panel, please pop them into the Q&A function on Zoom, and we will do our best to get to them towards the end of the program. Okay, so now I am so delighted to introduce you to all of our panelists today, each of whom are experts in their own right, and who we get to learn from during this conversation. So I am going to begin with Astrid Dominguez. Astrid, if you could join me on camera. Astrid is, hello, welcome. Astrid Dominguez is the Executive Director of the Good Neighbor Settlement House in Brownsville, Texas. Previously, Astrid was the Director of the Border Rights Center at the ACLU of Texas. And in that role, she managed the development and implementation of border-related policy and advocacy and communication strategies. Astrid first joined the ACLU of Texas as a Border Rights Fellow and later served as a policy and advocacy coordinator, focusing her work on border residents and migrants' civil and human rights. Prior to joining the ACLU of Texas, Astrid worked for the Mexican Foreign Ministry at the consulates of Brownsville, Texas, and Phoenix, Arizona. Astrid is a graduate of the Universidad Autónoma de Nuevo León. Welcome, Astrid. We're so happy to have you. Next, I will invite Kate to join me on camera. Kate Clark is the Senior Director of Immigration Services at Jewish Family Service of San Diego. And in this role, Kate oversees JFS's immigration services. She advocates on behalf of San Diego's immigrant and refugee communities, and she manages and leads the San Diego Rapid Response Network's migrant shelter. In 2018, Kate led JFS's and the Rapid Response Network's Herculean efforts to create an emergency shelter for newly arrived asylum-seeking families who have been recently released from federal immigration custody as they wait to make their case in immigration court in the United States. Since late November 2018, as Kate will share, the shelter has welcomed more than 192,000 individuals here in San Diego, providing respite sheltering, medical screenings, warm meals and new clothes, legal guidance, and transportation assistance to help families get to their loved ones and networks of care in the United States. Kate is a graduate of San Diego State University and of Cal Western School of Law. Thank you so much, Kate, for being with us today. And lastly, but certainly not least, I'll invite Pedro to join us on camera. Pedro Rios is the director of the American Friends Service Committee's U.S.-Mexico Border Program and has been on staff with AFSC since 2003. Pedro oversees a program that documents abuses by law enforcement agencies, collaborates with community groups, advocates for policy change, and works with migrant communities to build collective leadership locally and throughout the border region. Pedro serves and has served as a steering committee member and as a board member of several organizations that advocate for humane and dignified policies for the southern border. Pedro also regularly volunteers with water stations, which sets up and services water stations in California's Imperial County deserts to prevent migrant deaths. Pedro is a native San Diegan and also a photographer and a writer. And he has a master's degree in ethnic studies from San Francisco State University. Thank you, Pedro, and thank you to all three of you for joining us today. I cannot say enough how excited we are to have this conversation, which I think is critical and timely, particularly in this moment. So to just get us started, we are here today to talk about solutions for border policy. And as I have previewed, and as I know each of you will elaborate upon, each of you is very much grounded in, in your respective border regions. But to start, I want to acknowledge that we often talk about the border as sort of a monolith. And, in the United States, the reality is that, one, we share land borders with two countries. The southern border spans across 4 states, and there are actually international ports of entry in nearly every state in the country, including at airports. And, Border Patrol, one of the federal agencies that is tasked with enforcing federal immigration laws near and at the border, claims jurisdiction within 100 miles of any land or maritime border, which actually covers a much larger portion of the United States than many people know. So to kick us off today, I would love if each of you could share how you personally define the border and how that informs your work. So Astrid, we'll start with you, and then Pedro and Kate, I'd love to hear from both of you as well.
Thank you, Monika. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here with all of you today. The border, it's home. This is where I grew up. This is the region that, I'm raising my daughter. And for those of us that are border natives, fronterizos, seeing the changes throughout the years at our border region, has really impacted, the work that we do. The border in Brownsville, it's very different from other regions. And I think each border region is very unique. San Diego to Brownsville, Arizona, it's all intertwined, but it has its own uniqueness. And for people to think of it just as a line with no one living there, it's a problem. And when we think of people arriving at our border and what that looks like, we've heard a lot about the chaos. Those of us that are here at the border, serving the migrants, welcoming the migrants, can tell you, we are doing our best to make sure that, it's in a coordinated way, it's in a humane way, but it's in a way that also shows who we are as a community. And as border communities, we're welcoming, we're resilient. People are coming through, some are staying, but most of them are passing through. So I think that when we think of the border, we shouldn't think of it as just a line, because it's not. We live here. We many of us were born here, we're raised here. And, we're doing our best to support those that are coming and that are arriving, whether they're staying here in a border region or not.
Pedro, do you want to take it next?
Yeah, thank you, Monika. And I also want to express my appreciation to the Center for Immigration Law and Policy, to you, Monika, to Hiroshi, and all the team there for the invitation and the confidence in what we have to say, and my fellow panelists as well. What can I say about the border? I mean, I think Astrid already, I think I do share Astrid's thoughts in terms of considering myself a fronterizo, considering the border region home. The border region, I should say, is a dynamic part of the world. It's made up of vibrant communities, each with their own histories, dating back thousands, millions of years. In fact, the original peoples continue to be an important part of the border region and these communities. We have collaborated with the Kumeyaay locally in San Diego, for instance, and being able to share those stories that inform how we define our communities. The landscapes are beautiful and unique, populated by special flora and wildlife not found in any other geographies around the world. There are large cities, vast dry deserts that can be unforgiving for those traversing through them. Border communities are also ground zero, though, for immigration enforcement practices that depend on a process of militarizing human life. And that's what I think what some of us or all of us will speak on later. But it's this natural beauty that's scarred then by the landscape of militarization, the deadly 30-foot tall border walls, the immigration checkpoints entering and leaving our communities, the boots on the ground, the surveillance towers, all of which are concentrated in our communities and that represent a contradiction to the dignity that we would want to uphold for those that are seeking safety. For me, then, it's this simultaneous existence of this reality, the beauty contrasted by the suffering, and these contradictions then to the human experience that inform my work, and from which I hope to impart my experiences. Thank you.
I go next. So thank you to the CILP team for having me, and appreciate also the incredible panelists, Pedro and Astrid. So I was thinking of the border both from the perspective of where I've lived now for the last 23 years, and as a practitioner for the last 14, but also how, and I'll talk a little bit more about this as we go, but hovering between the legal services modality and the humanitarian space that Jewish Family Services offers and operates within. So I thought about the border. It's an estimated 2,000-mile stretch of land. To me, it's a arbitrary quote line in the sand, but that border represents a symbol of hope, resilience, opportunity, protection, pain, refuge, abuse, and despair. And all of those things exist and coexist at the same time. I think about our beautiful binational border community that is very vibrant and thriving with a very rich culture and community. And I think about the transnational nature of the border and how journeys begin somewhere on the other side, oftentimes in countries very, very far away. And then I think about the closeness of the border as it relates to California, where there's an estimated 140-mile stretch of land, and how within those 140 miles, as Pedro was mentioning, we have this militarization of the border with the presence of federal agencies like the Department of Homeland Security, Customs Border Protection, the Office of Field Operations, Border Patrol, and Immigration Customs Enforcement, really truly the alphabet soup of all of the federal agencies. And in that same vein, I think there's a lot of opaqueness and remoteness. It feels distant because of the militarization that is happening in our community. And so depending on the minute or the day, whether I'm wearing the legal hat where, DREFAS is providing pro bono services, with a team of 50 attorneys and Department of Justice accredited representatives, or whether we're wearing our humanitarian hat, as Monika mentioned, operating the San Diego Rapid Response Network Migrant Shelter, where we're welcoming, we're coming up on an important milestone of welcoming nearly 200,000 guests in the last 5.5 years. We are hovering between all of those different sort of themes of what the border represents in our community.
Thank you so much to each of you for those answers. I think that's also just really critical context to help situate what we're talking about here today. I have to say that as a fellow fronteriza, what you say, what each of you I think has said truly resonates, both, the piece about the border being home, and also this idea that the border, is simultaneously a place of tremendous beauty and, diverse flora and fauna, as Pedro mentioned, and resilience, and at the same time at the site of a lot of suffering and abuses. And so, that all really resonates, and I have to acknowledge that each of you, in spite of the challenges and how complicated things are, each of you do work that is so critical to maximize the humanity and the dignified treatment of both, longtime border residents and also of newcomers. So in addition to thanking you for being here with us today and for sharing those insights, I also just have to take a moment to thank you for that work that you do day in and day out, that is so critical. So, we're all fronterizos, but you certainly don't have to be geographically close to any part of the southern border to know that border policy and new migration have been consuming the airwaves for a very long time. But in particular, especially as we gear up for a general election, and in the wake of the Senate's failure to pass a bipartisan border bill just last month. So, the images that you see on the screen right now are the kinds of images that a Google search for the U.S. southern border yields. And I have to say this, it's yields those results today, and it's also been yielding those results for months and years. We want to have a conversation today about solutions for border policy. But in order to do that, I think it's really important that we start by naming what the challenges look like, in this moment. And so to continue the conversation, Pedro, you and your colleagues have been working for a long time to respond to many, many different challenges at the southern border, and especially in recent months here in San Diego. Can you give us a snapshot of what you see as the sort of primary challenges in terms of humane border policy at the southern border?
Absolutely, Monika, and I think part of it will be a context into what has led to where we're at today, and I think it would be important, or it is important, to begin with what I believe is a continued reliance on a strategy known as prevention through deterrence, and this is a strategy that informs border policy that leads to inhumane policies. This strategy was developed in the mid-90s, which included the concept of territorial denial, and which sought to weaponize nature. And how this looked then on the ground was that as major cities became fortified by having a significant presence of Border Patrol agents stationed in the larger metropolitan cities, with increased enforcement infrastructure such as border walls as well as surveillance towers, this intentionally then pushed the migration route into much more treacherous terrain, where the natural landscape then, such as the deserts and the mountains, became the primary obstacles for people that were migrating into the U.S. Consequently, then, we started seeing an increase of people that were dying in these much more remote areas as they attempted to cross into the country. In more recent years, the same deterrent strategy continues to be the foundation for inhumane border policies and policies that continue to deteriorate the right to asylum. And so we saw this proposal in the Senate bill just a couple of weeks ago, where essentially it would have eviscerated the very basic premise and the promise to asylum, the promise that was made post World War II of never again turning people away, slowly begins to become eviscerated as a result of these policies and measures. And so the acceptance, I think, has become one where policymakers are okay with the idea of people that are migrating to be harmed, and much worse, to be purposefully placed in harm's way, including the possibility that death could result because of these same policies. In more recent years, we saw Title 42, the Remain in Mexico program, efforts to meter who can and who cannot enter the U.S. through a port of entry, for instance. All these forcing people seeking asylum to be placed in much more dangerous predicaments. Even how the administration presumes it's the correct way of seeking asylum by using a faulty phone application is severely limited, and people who you would expect would be permitted to seek asylum because of the conditions that they're living or the conditions that they are fleeing from in their home countries, many of whom just don't have access to this application because of the faultiness that I mentioned, some of which includes just language inaccessibility, or the technology on the phones that they are carrying with them cannot compete with the phones of other people who are using the same application and making appointments that are beating out some of the individuals. From what I understand, the waiting period for some people in Tijuana goes back to July of last year when appointments were made, and they still have not been called. More recently, and I would ask some support with the photos, Sophia, if you can put the photos, please. The very first one, the first photo then shows a new tactic that Border Patrol started using, I would say late in 2022, in October, November is when we first started seeing that there were people that were waiting for 1 day, 2 days, 3 days in areas between the border walls in the most western part of the San Diego area, of the San Diego sector. This was, again, during the fall months of 2022. As we went into the spring months of 2023, in April and right before Title 42 ended, we started seeing many more people, dozens, and then hundreds of people, up to 700 people at once, waiting for 3 days, for 5 days, and up to 7 days in areas that we called as advocates, collectively as advocates, we call them open air detention sites. And this is where Border Patrol was pushing people to wait, telling them to walk a mile or two to get to this point, oftentimes driving people and dropping them off at these locations. And this is where they would wait without any food, without any water, without any conditions that would meet the very basic floor minimum of ensuring that the national standards known as TEDS would be followed. And TEDS essentially stands for how CBP and Border Patrol agents are supposed to transport, escort, detain, and search individuals that are under their custody. Next photo, please. And we see, for instance, that in many cases, Border Patrol would tell people to remove their shoelaces from their shoes as they waited. And Border Patrol and CBP much more generally would say these individuals are not under Border Patrol custody, but there were a number of measures that were done to ensure that people did not leave these designated open-air detention sites, including having people remove most of their clothing except for one pair of pants and one shirt or one cover on top, and containing people if they did move to seek food in other areas where food was accessible. Border Patrol would bring them back in. There was one reporter who witnessed how individuals in this area known as Whiskey 8 were able to move away from the double walls, and Border Patrol quickly came back and used their ATVs to push people back into the space between the border walls that is considered to be an enforcement zone, enforcement by Border Patrol. And the continued violations of TEDs, we started noting them and submitted complaints as a result of these conditions. The next photo, please. One of the conditions is that unless there is a serious risk to safety, people that Border Patrol is transporting should not be handcuffed. So when Border Patrol uses a private contractor to pick people up from these open air detention sites, they commonly will handcuff the men and women, all adults, as they are transporting them. In a recent conversation with Border Patrol officials, they indicated that the reason that they handcuff them is for the safety of the officers that are transporting them, even though I recently witnessed that someone who was transported who did not fit into the van that these private contractors were going to move people out of, was then sent to a Border Patrol van where in that same individual was not handcuffed. And so there are just a variety of discretionary and arbitrary measures that seem to be in violation of very basic standards for how people should be treated who are under Border Patrol and larger Customs and Border Protection policy. And we can end the photos now. And so in concluding this this piece, I think it's important to highlight that the deterrence measures that we've seen for several decades now are continued to be used in different ways in how people who are seeking asylum or people who are generally migrating are being treated by enforcement agencies, in particular Border Patrol, as they're entering the United States and as they're attempting to seek asylum by having all sorts of obstacles placed in front of them. And I think that does not bode well for how we're moving into this coming year and into next year, considering that the elections are defining the border as a site of war, as a site of conflict, and hence the treatment then of those people that are seeking asylum and trying to move away from the dangers that they are fleeing from are encountering a new set of circumstances that endanger their lives.
Thank you, Pedro, for that. Those images and the practices that they illustrate are just truly harrowing. And, you know, as somebody who's been based at the border for many years and who's practiced here over different administrations and different years, I think one of the things that is so clear to me, as I'm sure it is to you, is that it truly doesn't have to be this way. You know, there are other ways to process and to welcome newcomers at the border. So I want to direct the next question at Kate and Astrid. So Pedro mentioned, you know, obstacles to accessing safety as one of, if not the primary challenge that he's observed in his work in San Diego and at the southern border. And this includes things like accessing, you know, the appointment system, what some people have called Ticketmaster for asylum, to approach ports of entry, to request asylum. It also includes people being trapped between the border walls and the open air detention sites, just awaiting an opportunity to be processed. But so Kate and Astrid, you both work with people who, for whatever reason, have been able to access processing at the southern border, right? They are individuals who have been processed and seek respite sheltering or support through your organizations once they've made it to the United States. But my question for you is, for those individuals who are able to access processing, you know, is it smooth sailing from there? And if not, what are the challenges that you encounter serving that population? And we can start with Kate.
Thanks, Monika. So I before I enter the smooth sailing part, I do want to spend a bit of time on the accessing processing, because I think it's worth just emphasizing. So accessing processing at the southern border is not a guarantee for anyone, as was just described. We could spend an entire day talking about this, but truly, I think I want to articulate that the individuals, that the guests that we're serving at our shelter, that the folks that we have the privilege of welcoming every day are truly what I consider to be the quote lucky ones. And while I am tremendously humbled to work alongside those individuals every single day while they're in our care, I often think about those who were not serving, and those who did not make it to safety, those who remain on the other side of the quote border, unable to access protection. And we see that in a lot of different ways. We see that in folks that are in our care, with other members of their family that are on the other side of the border. We see that with folks that are in our care and family members that are in long-term immigration custody. We see that with folks that are in our care and don't even know where their family members are, despite sort of traveling together up until they reach the border. So I truly just want to emphasize the access to processing, and that really, truly, it's not available in mass, and as it should be available as a protection opportunity for folks in precarious situations. So switching gears to answer the specific question, I think newcomers who are in our shelter, it's not smooth sailing, as I like to describe it. The solution that is the tool of border reception as an infrastructure, like our shelter or our travel center, is really just a tool to provide critical respite shelter services at an incredibly important inflection point in the non-citizen's journey to the border. I often share that we, as a respite shelter, are actually at the center of two broken systems. We're at the center of the broken immigration system, and we're at the center of a broken unsheltered system. But yet we, and I say we because I'm joined with colleagues like Astrid and so many others that are not on this call, have creatively iterated modalities where we can continue to welcome folks with dignity, compassion, and respect in a really thoughtful, human-centered way. So speaking specifically to our operation, medical services is really one of the important North Stars that we continue to center. We're really proud, along with our colleagues at UC San Diego Medical, that we have a less than 1% referral to the emergency department. And why that's important is because, again, you're talking about a third system. So if it's a trilateral system between immigration, unsheltered, and medical, those are very taxed systems. And how we can provide trauma-informed, culturally competent care to our guests and address their immediate medical needs is really, really important. The second is the connection to networks of care. I think how we started this conversation was headlines of the framing of the border. And I think we often hear these headlines that folks are coming, they don't have community contacts, they don't have family members, they don't have loved ones. And for us, that's simply not true. The data that we're seeing is less than 1% of the guests that we've had the privilege of serving don't have a point of contact, or they don't have a network of care. So really the vast majority are traveling to their loved ones, and we view it as our job to make that process as seamless and smooth as possible so that our guests can be connected with their networks of care across the United States. And I'd say the third is really legal empowerment and pro se legal assistance. So I talked about this in the intro. I think we have a unique lens of starting this shelter operations as a legal service provider. Again, with me being an immigration attorney, thinking through like how we can constantly empower our guests with information and knowledge. And I think I'll talk a little bit more about it, but more recently have had the opportunity to be co-located, USAIS, be co-located with us at our travel center. But really this is an opportunity, it's a moment in time to stop or pause everything that else is going on for the non-citizen guest that's before us, and allow our guests to take a deep breath and do everything that we can to wrap around them and equip them for the next step of this journey, which is undoubtedly going to be incredibly challenging, knowing that most are going to move forward not with an advocate or counsel in the next phase of their immigration proceedings. So that's sort of the framing that we've tried to approach this work, and our ability to be part of the solution and vision opportunities for rebuilding a human-centered immigration system.
Thank you, Kate. Astrid, do you have something to add?
Thank you. Here in Brownsville at Good Neighbor Settlement House, we've been welcoming migrants officially since 2018. When Border Patrol would release migrants in the middle of the night or bus station, it's not 24/7. So migrants were lost, like, in the city at 1 a.m. So the city of Brownsville, who's been a leader and a champion in our region, that and collaborates, have a great partnership with the NGOs, decided to step in and coordinate the welcoming effort. So in partnership with the city, Good Neighbor Settlement House, along with other nonprofits, provides the reception here in this area. The city helps them with travel arrangements, and we provide the humanitarian support, such as the meals, hygiene items they might need. You saw in the pictures, sometimes they arrive without shoelaces, and that's something so basic. So providing shoelaces and any other items, like baby powder and milk for babies, diapers, wipes, and anything you can think of that can get them to their next step. What we see in terms of the system, making sure that we're thinking of safe ways. We don't want to make it harder for migrants to arrive to the border. So taking a step back, what Kate said, it's so important that, we're thinking of those solutions, but in a humane-centered way and not making it harder. Migrants are waiting in Mexico. We've been to shelters in Mexico. We've talked to people and told them, like, this is what you need, this is what you need to expect. This is what you need to plan for. So that when they arrive to the border, they're prepared. They know, right? It's a quick stop. It's a pit stop at times. And Brownsville works very different. For example, that in San Diego or other areas, 80% of the migrants that we receive in Brownsville leave the same day. This is, some of you might heard, like the Brownsville model. We don't have enough overnight. So along with the city of Brownsville, we try to find a departure for those, for those migrants who arrive to our city, and they depart the same day. So we are that, quick stop where we want to make sure that they have enough resources so they can get to the next destination. And that looks like, the meals, obviously, but also the legal empowerment. So they know what's next. And it's hard because at times they've gone through so much, right? They've waited so long in Mexico. They got through the appointment, they're overwhelmed. So throwing all these resources at them at once, it's just, they're not going to connect. So making sure we're trying to address it in the, in a welcoming manner, in a humane way, and giving them, we give them flyers like, when you're ready, go through this, and make sure that, you follow up with a legal provider, and we provide them with like QR codes so they can, they can scan that, and then after that they can, wherever they're going, they can find that support that they need. We want to set them up for success. And this quick stop at the border with the NGOs is that, because we want to make sure that they're getting where they need to be going and they have the resources to be successful. Challenges, of course, when we think of the number of appointments, and that is not, the one solution, but that is the one solution that is currently existing and at the table. But there isn't enough appointments. And, the amount of people waiting because of, migration worldwide is at its highest, not just here at the US-Mexico border. But, making sure that we have enough appointments so people can come. There's enough information out there. And this is something that, we work in partnership with the government. None of this could be done in an orderly and efficient way without us having conversations with the government, of course. And we tell them, migrants need to hear from you. And they can't just hear, don't come, because that's not gonna, like, if someone has crossed the area and has crossed all the way to Mexico and sat the border waiting to cross, they're just gonna do whatever it takes, whether it's waiting for an appointment or in desperation, just crossing between ports. But, they want that information from the government. And it's not just like, please stop, don't come. These are all the consequences for it, right? There are pathways, and they need to be informed of those pathways. Seeking asylum is legal. They can still do that. So making sure that there is that official information from the government, that it's not just a deterrent message, it's key, because we still want to frame this welcoming in a safe way and in a humane way.
That's all really helpful. And I think that last point that you shared, Astrid, is so telling of this broader moment that we're in, where so much of the public discourse right now about the border and about border policy involves despair about, this allegedly or in fact growing numbers of newcomers, and many of the so-called solutions and policy that we hear lawmakers or policymakers share, they entertain the idea of suppressing new migration, right? So it's like solutions by deterring or solutions by suppressing migration. And whether that's, that we've seen that in calls to shut down the border, whatever that means, both at the executive level and also from people in Congress. But also, we've seen Texas's attempt to erect razor wire and buoys in different regions of its border. But it's also relevant to, so-called solutions that seek to penalize newcomers or restrict asylum eligibility. It really has permeated so many of the different supposed solutions or policy proposals. But what strikes me about this conversation, and frankly about working with each of you over the years, is that so much of you and your organizations take on a different approach, right? You each discuss welcoming efforts as foundational to your work and as foundational to solutions for this moment that we're in. And so I'm going to take just a moment of moderator's privilege here to share that at CILP, we truly believe in smart immigration policy that is grounded in welcoming. And just one very timely example that I want to share is the parole program, the humanitarian parole program that Hiroshi previewed at the top of this call. For those who don't know, it's a program that was announced by the Biden administration early last year in January 2023, that allows people from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela to people from those countries with foreign sponsors to seek and obtain advanced travel authorization to come to the interior of the country of the United States to request humanitarian parole for a period of up to 2 years. And during that period of parole, those individuals are eligible for work permits. So, again, this program started over a year ago, last January, and a coalition of Republican-led states, led by Texas, filed a lawsuit to try to block this parole program, claiming that their states were harmed by individuals who came through the program. Now, here at CILP, we went to trial last summer to defend against these efforts. And just last Friday, we won an order through which the federal judge hearing the case dismissed Texas's lawsuit, finding that Texas actually couldn't prove that it was harmed at all by this program, and thereby upholding the, what we call CHNV, or the Humanitarian Parole Program for people from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And so this is an image of one of our clients, Eric CILP. He's a program sponsor who actually testified at trial together with his longtime friend whom he sponsored through the program. And on the other side of the screen is just the order we were very excited about, again, dismissing Texas's lawsuit. So I'll go back to our regularly scheduled program here. And I'll acknowledge that, CHNV is just one example of these kinds of solutions, which, as Hiroshi mentioned, is very much a solution that is really exists and is foundational outside of the border region. And it allows people from their home country, they're from outside of the United States, to seek advanced travel authorization to travel to an interior port of entry in the United States. That means, an international airport. But again, that's just one example. And so each of you have previewed some of this in your earlier answers, but I'm wondering if each of you can discuss or elaborate upon the solutions that you have explored and pursued that are grounding in this welcoming frame, and how they can be wielded on a more systemic level to address the challenges that we've discussed. So I will, maybe if we can start with Pedro, and then Kate, and then Astrid.
Thank you, Monika. It's important to highlight also, I think, within what the comments that you were making and pointing back to the collaborative work that all of our organizations have done together with various coalitions, not only in our regional work, in our county, so in San Diego County, for instance, and how we're able to share information with each other in our respective areas of work, but also across the border. So not only from here all the way to Brownsville, but then also with our colleagues and friends in Mexican border towns as well. And that collaborative nature has been important for us to be able to provide these proposals for what solutions could be. I think to begin with, we need to have an all-of-government approach that also seeks guidance from the civil society organizations and coalitions, so that the grounding of the work is based on the wealth of experiences that we have. And that certainly has been a problem that in San Diego we've been able to highlight for our county board of supervisors, for instance, where there really hadn't been an authentic way of the county board of reaching out to organizations that have experience on working on these issues, to addressing, for instance, how do we open a welcoming center that really is based from the work experience of organizations on the ground, and not simply because it's a nonprofit that might have access to a lot of funding. So this all-of-government approach must also involve conversations and dialogue between the local governments, the state governments, and the federal government, and that it becomes a consistent advocacy from the local representatives who should be taking our guidance on how to move forward on policies and approaches. I think another solution would be, as my presentation kind of moved in that direction, calling for an end to the use of deterrence strategies that inform policy and recentering the humanitarian needs and human rights of people that are on the move and people that are arriving as newcomers into our counties. Because we've had 30 years of prevention through the deterrent strategies that have failed and only have created the conditions where more people are suffering, more people are dying. Just to mention that the border wall, the height of the border wall, was in some ways developed based on psychological field tests that Border Patrol conducted to determine at what height a normal individual would become disoriented. And so the expectation of building a border wall that high would be that people would fall and become injured, or much worse, would die. And this is what we're seeing. We're seeing mass events. Last Saturday, there were 8 people that fell in one incident. The Saturday before that, there were 10 people that fell in one single incident. And throughout the week, we're seeing people arrive at the border with injuries. And lastly, I would suggest that we must have stronger standards that protect people who are under Border Patrol custody. The standards that I mentioned, the TED standards, are just the floor. We need to seek an approach that really highlights the premise that people's dignity should be upheld, that they should be respected, especially when they are under the custody of a police force that we have well documented has operated with impunity for many, many years.
Thank you, Pedro. Kate, do you want to share?
Thanks, Monika. Yeah, so first I want to say I've just been, I think, beaming throughout this conversation just at the opportunity to talk about solutions. So I just want to again express gratitude and manifest that we as advocates in this space and in a movement should prioritize like these conversations a lot more than we are. So thanks again to the CILP team. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about our recent work with the Safe Mobility Offices, which the administration announced within the last year. So by way of background, so we were approached to assist based on our shelter work, right? We are in a unique situation where we support non-citizens in being able to move on to their final destinations via lawful pathways. And there's a lot of synergies actually when you're talking about scale on how to do that in a different context. So never did I think that we would be asked to do this abroad, but nevertheless, here we are, and we're excited to partner on this new innovative lawful pathway. So for reference, the Safe Mobility offices are operational now in Colombia, Guatemala, Ecuador, and Costa Rica. And there are many different components of the concepts. I'll refer to it as SMO. But really at the crux of the SMOs are the ability for non-citizens to be considered for U.S. refugee assistance program support or eligibility. And this is being done for the first time in the Western Hemisphere. Importantly, if somebody that is going through the SMO, which there's a triage, or there's an entry point, I should say, which is managed by international organizations like UNHCR and IOM, or the International Office of Migration. So through this screening or eligibility, of course, like the macro goal is to have as many refugees eligible for entry via the SMOs that are in those countries. But importantly, not everyone is eligible. And as I think Hiroshi stated at the outset, right, we have this old definition that's not comporting with the current needs of folks that are needing to access protection, and a larger number of folks that still find themselves in very precarious situations where they need to find immediate safety and security. So through the SMOs, there's this new approach to also consider, for those that are not found eligible for U.S. refugee assistance program eligibility, a referral over to the parole pathway, and USCIS will consider on a case-by-case basis a humanitarian parole for a 3-year period. So this is another instance that, you know, I think we can talk for an entire day, like this specific lawful pathway. But I think it's, as we've seen it, and I'll share a little bit more, an innovative solution that really, from my experience of being on the border, provides for the possibility of agency for folks to not have to make the treacherous journey to the border. I mean, I have the lived experience of every day hearing the stories of what it looks like for our guests at the shelter. And I just can't help but be excited about the opportunity to help folks closer to home in a more open environment. And so I think this comes on the heels of other critical innovations like we've seen, and a couple of them have been mentioned in this call. But really the U4U program, OAW, CHNV, as Monika mentioned, and yeah, with great gratitude to the CILP and JAC team for that uplifting victory last week. I think at the core of all these programs are lawful pathways and solutions and opportunities for non-citizens to avoid, again, that treacherous journey to the border. It's not lost on me also that we need to do this in parallel. Like, there's not going to be a substitute for asylum. And so I want to be clear that I am not suggesting that these parole programs are a substitute for asylum, but I don't think that this needs to be an either or conversation. It can be an and, because I can tell you from the near 50 non-citizens that we've successfully traveled on the parole pathway from Guatemala to the United States, to their final destinations, to their networks of care, that the ability to be paroled in the United States at this moment in time is a game changer for them and their family. So I briefly wanted to share that, and I know that there's a lot more time, so I'm happy to talk about some of the shelter solutions a little bit later, but again, just gratitude for the opportunity to have this conversation.
Thank you, Kate. What about Astrid in Brownsville? What do you all envision?
Thank you. So, in terms of the shelter part, I think, it does need to become a more robust program. And I think, we've had plenty of conversations with the federal government on what that would look like. It needs to be, we are a partner with them. in welcoming migrants. So it has to be funded and it has to be in a it has to be sustained. On the other hand, I think, to Kate's point of the long-term solutions, and there are these new programs and, thinking outside of the box, but there are a couple solutions that could be made immediately. And I'll just name a few. Expanding CBP1 appointments. Only 8 ports of entry have CBP1 appointments right now. So we're expanding it, to every port of entry would be, a huge difference, which means more appointments for people. So people don't have to wait that long for that appointment. That's just one that could be made. I'm concerned that humanitarian solutions are not being given a chance to actually work. So just lately, in the past, what is it, Kate, 3 months, the border shelters have been able to, some border shelters, not all, have been able to have a pilot of employment authorization clinic. And, so that when migrants arrive, as soon as they arrive, while they're having that welcome, they're also able to apply for an employment authorization permit. And once they do that, they reach their final destination and, maybe like about a month, they will get their permit, which will then relieve some of those receiving cities. And that's huge, but we need to invest in it too. That comes with that part. And when I talk about sustainability, this is what I'm talking about too. So it's a win-win, right? Like migrants are doing this immediately as soon as they arrive at the border. And then when they get, in a month, they might be able to receive their work permit at their destination. And it doesn't represent a burden to those cities that are, are also stretched thin. But we have to give it a try. And I think we're trying way too late. This should have been thought and brought up like probably 3 years ago. The other to that, ICE transporting to destinations. And Kate, when we talk about shelter and, how we're getting migrants or, they're going to one place to another, this is one that it has not been given a chance or even try, but we should be considering that. ICE transporting migrants, when we think of what Arizona is going through with all this, with the number of people that are arriving, we hear about lateral busing, lateral flights, and so forth. ICE can be transporting to other cities, coordinating in the same way they're coordinating with us NGOs at the border. That way, that capacity that they have, it's also, we're stretching all of our resources and we're tapping into others. So like thinking outside of the box. That's another solution that could, that hasn't been used, but that, the government has at their hand. And the last one also, it's vertical processing capabilities, especially when we're talking about processing and, the overcrowding. I think that is another one. We have the Northern Border Patrol stations and, port of entry. There is the video teleconferencing pretty much that should be used. We know there's some areas that have, for example, Donna in the RGV, that's like the big processing facility. It's temporary, but the huge tents, each have like the VTC. So as there's plenty of technology out there, right? We can all think creatively how to make sure that migrants are being processed as fast as they can so they can get out of there and continue moving onward. So those are some immediate ones that we had are, like available pretty much. And when I say we, I think the government also takes, part in this to make sure that, these solutions are being used.
Well, wow. I know that you're each experts, but listening to you collectively really, really makes me feel like we have a lot of solutions that are available to us here. If I'm listening correctly, it sounds like collectively what I hear the three of you saying is that, we need to expand humanitarian pathways for people to be able to avoid the treacherous journey to the border altogether. But for those who, for whatever reason, are forced to seek protection at the border, we need to expand access to ports of entry and reject deterrence or policies grounded in punitive goals, and also expand the system of humane reception that includes the streamlining of the work permit process. I personally haven't heard it laid out that clearly in other spaces. I just really appreciate the clarity that you've each brought to this conversation. We are really getting dangerously close to the end of the time that we have. And I want to leave just at least a couple minutes at the end for a couple of these really great audience questions. But I want to take just, like if we can take 2 minutes, Kate, if I have a question for you to wrap up this portion. As Astrid previewed a little bit, she can preview this. I think it's tempting to think about a lot of these solutions that you all have shared and that I've distilled as very limited in applicability to the border region, to the geographic space that is the southern border. But as Astrid previewed, a lot of these things can have very real, concrete effects in receiving cities on the interior. And so I'm wondering, Kate, if you could take like 1 or 2 minutes to share with us how might some of the solutions that you all have encountered and explored be directly transferable to the cities on the receiving end of these journeys?
Sure. Yeah. So I think I'll take the USAS co-location first, and then if we have a second, I'll do the SMO. So the solution that Astrid started to talk about. So there's 3, I think, ports of entry: San Diego, El Paso, and Brownsville that have USAS co-location in various forms. And importantly, when this co-location is paired with pro se legal assistance, there's this incredible power that is non-citizens who are arriving at the border that then are traveling onto their networks of care, as we've talked about ad nauseum today, are then leaving the border reception sites on a pathway to self-sufficiency. And so they're arriving to their destination in the interior. Again, I think we're seeing processing times of around 30 days for, with a fee waiver and EAD in hand, which is incredible. And so folks can, then be empowered to begin to work, it's inherent in being self-sufficient, right? So I think it's really doubling down and supporting the innovations like that. Alongside the administration, of course, there needs to be the matched investment. I think we're speaking for JFS, we're trying to just patch it together from a funding. We're not being resourced from the government to do this work. And so but it's important for us to center the humans again and the opportunity that we have before us to be part of the solution. The second, I think, is around this coordination piece with the interior. So now being a shelter operator for 5.5 years, I can tell you that migrants and non-citizens from our shelter have traveled to probably all 50 states in the last 5.5 years, but yet this is the first year, last year was the first year where there was headlines that were all of these newcomers arriving to our shelter and what do we do, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that opportunity from the current challenge is a moment of coordination with the border reception sites and the interior to the extent that can be more centralized, but also talking about the communities of welcome writ large. And those, again, go back to some of the other lawful pathway programs like CHNV, the SMO initiative, U4U, and the OAW, which are just the ones that I can think of off the top of my head, and thinking through how can we begin to synergize around communities of welcome and what that looks like systemically. So I just had the pleasure of actually touring the shelter this morning, a group of Office of New Americans from across the country. And it was an incredible conversation because all of these offices had these incredible ideas about how the border can collaborate with the interior, but yet there's not really a space or an opportunity for us to sort of carve out the work and have a conversation about what symbiotic relationship would result from just even a conversation or a more concerted effort to collaborate. So I think the solutions are truly endless to integrate the border and the interior together.
Gosh, well, this has been such a rich discussion. And even as somebody who works with, I think, each of you in different capacities, some of you more frequently than others, I personally would love to keep peppering you with questions to further explore these solutions. But I'm going to take a second here. We have a handful of really great questions from the audience. So I'm going to share some of those here. So the first question, and I think either of you any of the three of you could answer this. So it is, can you say more about how and why people are losing contact with family members or fellow travelers during processing at the border in 2024? And I think each of you could answer this. Is there somebody who would like to take it first? Pedro, is it something that, great.
Yeah, I mean, I can, you know, from what I see at the open air detention site, oftentimes families that come together, especially if they are extended families, get separated. So for instance, if you might have a father, a mother, and an adult son who's 19 years old, and that adult son might get separated because he's considered to be traveling on his own, even though he is with his family. We've also seen in the past where we might have like a common law marriage, and so common law marriages are separated, and the men are sent to another open air detention site in an area that is far away from where we don't have access to. And so they each will be picked up at a different time and possibly processed at a different time and possibly released at a different time. So oftentimes when the street releases are happening, we'll run into family members who are looking for their other family members, and sometimes that might mean waiting for the next bus to arrive from Border Patrol, or waiting for the next bus to arrive the next day or in a few days. And sometimes there are people that are waiting at the airport who still haven't yet received their family members. Other separations occur if someone falls from the border wall and they need to be taken to the hospital for emergency care and they're traveling with a family member. That's another way that, at least at the immediate border area, that families are separated. And we try as best as possible to retain their contacts so that we're able then to bring them together as a vulnerable population now. But it's extremely difficult to do so, even though we have had some success. And just a final point, we've had cases where both Border Patrol or Mexican National Guard will separate families at the point of crossing. So Border Patrol agent, this was the case where we filed a complaint with Office of Professional Responsibility. Border Patrol pointed a gun at two young men on the Tijuana side while the mother and youngest child were crossing, but the 12-year-old daughter was left on the Tijuana side. And so that's another case of separation. We've had two cases like that. In the other case, it was a Mexican National Guard that moved the ladder around and the mom fell. So that was another case. So we see those types of cases as well that result in separation, unfortunately.
I just mentioned very briefly that JFS, San Diego, CILP, and ACLU of San Diego and Imperial counties for the last several years have been engaging in advocacy with the administration to really, prevent and remedy these ongoing separations that we see among family members of the same family, including adult members of the same family. So a lot of advocacy on that, or around that as well. The next question I'm going to propose, and I think it'll be the last question that we have time for, is the question is, it is very inspiring that there are so many potential solutions, but what do each of you perceive to be hindering such solutions from being implemented? And anybody who would like to take the question, please kick us off.
I could start. I think like the just lack of moral courage, political courage to engage in a conversation about how solutions are a possibility and are very real. I see that every single day. Unfortunately, I have to defend the existence of our shelter every single day with all levels of government, but yet it's a effective tool in the toolbox to providing a humanitarian and human-centered welcoming. So I honestly just think it's like lack of moral and political courage.
Anyone else want to take that? Go ahead.
Just very briefly echoing that, and also the viewpoint that people who are migrating don't have agency, that they are not actors capable of determining for themselves what their future should be, and seeing them as expendable, and the level of opportunism around border issues is not in their favor right now, and so that makes it much more difficult to do the humanitarian aid work that we're doing and to lift up the importance of human rights and the protections that everyone should have, including people on the move.
Thank you both. I saw that there was also a question about the current state of the CHNB parole program. Just to answer very briefly that as of right now, that program remains in effect. The states have filed a notice of appeal, but that's one caveat. The other caveat is that it's very difficult to predict what will happen after the election. But for right now and for the foreseeable future, the program remains in effect, and any pending applications should continue to be processed. With that, I would love to ask each of our panelists if you have like 30 seconds to share any closing thoughts, and then we'll invite Hiroshi back to close us out. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Monika. And so I'll just say, I think we as a collective and as a country, we need to continue to center these solutions from a humanitarian lens. We need to make sure that whoever is coming to our country can do it in a safe way.
Pedro?
Thank you again for the opportunity, and lifting up and centering human rights, I think is important in terms of how we move forward with developing policy that recognizes human dignity of people that are in a vulnerable situation, especially those that are migrating.
Echoing the gratitude, and I'll just say that even while you might not be proximate to the border, there's all of us have the capability of being part of the solution, whether you're in the interior or at the border. There's a lot of welcoming that we can all do.
Yeah, I just want to just jump in here. We're just about out of time, but I'm so grateful for this rich discussion. Thank you, Astrid, Kate, Pedro, and Monika. You've shown that the border is a place can be of cruelty, neglect, of lack of moral courage, but it's also a place of beauty, of welcome, resilience, dignity, and opportunity to move things forward. One short housekeeping note: those of you who are registered for this webinar, you'll receive an email with a link to the recording. And so let me close this out by saying thank you to all who were able to join us today. We really appreciate your being here, and we'll see you at the next one.